Have you ever imagined what it would be like to reach that point where no one can touch you anymore? Not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, essentially? Thomas woke up startled at 3 in the morning, as had been happening for the past few weeks. His 42 years weighed more heavily than ever as he stared at the ceiling of his empty apartment. That deafening silence, that overwhelming loneliness. The man everyone admired, the successful executive, was now nothing but a shadow of himself. 7 years ago, Thomas had made a decision that would completely change his existence, to become unattainable. Who would have thought that this much-desired transformation would be the beginning of a journey into his own abyss? What happens when we build walls so high that not even we can climb them? Carl Jung warned of this danger almost a century ago, but Thomas, like so many others, would only understand through his own pain. The morning light filtered through the expensive blinds of Thomas's penthouse, illuminating a pristine space that felt more like a museum than a home. Every object had its designated place, every surface polished to perfection, much like the persona he had carefully crafted over the years. Thomas adjusted his tailored suit while staring at his reflection in the mirror, a ritual he performed with mechanical precision. His colleagues often joked that he was an enigma, a living puzzle no one could solve. But there was no pride in his eyes anymore, only a hollow gaze that seemed to search for something lost long ago. Carl Jung would have recognized this immediately as the consequence of excessive individuation gone wrong. The Swiss psychiatrist had warned that when one becomes too separate, too differentiated from others, the shadow grows proportionally larger. For Jung, this shadow represented all the rejected aspects of our personality, growing darker and more powerful with each connection we sever. Thomas had spent years building his fortress of emotional invulnerability, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, until he achieved what he thought was perfect self-sufficiency. The elevator descended, 43 floors, just like every weekday for the past 12 years. Thomas checked his watch. 7:35 exactly. His schedule was a masterpiece of efficiency, leaving no room for unexpected human interaction. An experiment conducted at Harvard University had shown that individuals who consistently avoid meaningful connections develop a particular neural pattern, similar to those experiencing physical pain when confronted with intimacy. Thomas had no knowledge of this study, yet his brain had become a perfect case example, rewiring itself to perceive vulnerability as danger. Outside, the city pulsed with life, thousands of souls intertwining in the dance of human connection that Thomas observed like an alien anthropologist. A young couple laughed as they shared a coffee, a mother comforted her crying child, an elderly man fed pigeons on a bench, surrounded by strangers who had become morning acquaintances. All these scenes Thomas registered with clinical detachment, unaware that his unconscious mind was starving for precisely what he was witnessing. Jung called this the collective unconscious, that shared psychic substrate that connects all human beings at a level beyond personal experience. "Good morning, Mr. Evans," said Sarah, his assistant of 5 years, as he entered the office. Her greeting bounced off him like light off a mirror. Thomas nodded curtly and proceeded to his corner office, maintaining the precise emotional distance he had calibrated over the years. What he failed to notice was the slight change in her tone, a newly developed formality that matched his own. The irony that Jung would have appreciated. As Thomas became more unattainable, the world adjusted by becoming equally unattainable to him. It was the psychological equivalent of an autoimmune response, protection turning against the very thing it was meant to safeguard. The quarterly board meeting proceeded as usual, with Thomas delivering a flawless presentation on company growth. Numbers, projections, strategies. These were safe territories where emotion had no jurisdiction. Yet something unusual happened when the new marketing director, Eleanor, challenged his approach. "Your strategy lacks human connection," she said, her words cutting through the sterile atmosphere of the conference room. "Our customers don't just want efficiency, they want to feel understood." For a fraction of a second, Thomas felt a crack in his armor, a momentary disorientation that puzzled him. Jung would have identified this moment as an anima confrontation, the feminine aspect of Thomas's psyche forcing its way into consciousness through an external figure. In Jungian psychology, the anima represents the unconscious feminine side of a man, carrying all the relational qualities he has suppressed. The more one denies this aspect, the more powerfully it emerges in projected form, often through attraction, irritation, or in Thomas's case, unexpected emotional disruption. Elena's challenge had somehow bypassed his carefully constructed defenses. Back in his office, Thomas found himself strangely distracted, an unusual state for someone known for his laser focus. His mind kept returning to Elena's words, not just their content, but the direct way she had addressed him, as if she could actually see him, not just his immaculate professional facade. A study from the University of California had shown that prolonged emotional isolation actually alters perception, creating a distorted lens through which all human interaction is viewed as either threatening or irrelevant. Thomas had mastered this perceptual filter, yet something was now interfering with its operation. That evening, as he walked toward the parking garage, Thomas spotted his reflection in a store window. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself, this perfectly groomed stranger with eyes that held no light. Jung described this phenomenon as dissociation from the self, where one's conscious identity becomes so removed from the totality of the psyche that the person experiences moments of derealization. The self, in Jungian terms, represents the unification of consciousness and unconsciousness, the whole personality that transcends the ego. Thomas had been running from this wholeness for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be fully human. The dream came again that night, more vivid than ever before. Thomas found himself in a labyrinth of mirrored walls, each reflection showing a different version of himself. As a child, as a teenager, as the young man who still knew how to laugh. At the center stood a figure shrouded in shadow, calling his name with a voice that seemed to resonate from the depths of time itself. Jung called these autonomous dream figures archetypes, universal patterns present in the collective unconscious that emerge when the psyche is trying to communicate essential truths. The shadowy figure was Thomas's guide, his wise old man archetype, attempting to lead him back to wholeness. The next morning, something unprecedented happened. Thomas was late for work, 23 minutes late to be exact. His perfectly calibrated routine had been disrupted by the lingering effects of the dream, leaving him disoriented and strangely vulnerable. As he hurried through the lobby, he collided with a woman carrying coffee, the hot liquid splashing across his immaculate suit. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, mortified. Thomas opened his mouth to deliver his usual cold response, but instead found himself saying, "It's all right. Accidents happen." The words felt foreign on his tongue, as if spoken by someone else. This slip in Thomas's carefully maintained persona represents what Jung called regression in service of transcendence, a necessary breakdown of rigid psychological structures to allow for new growth. In a landmark study on emotional resilience, researchers at Columbia University discovered that individuals who maintain perfect control often experience more catastrophic psychological breakdowns than those who allow themselves regular emotional flexibility. Thomas's small moment of genuine human response was the first hairline fracture in a dam that had been holding back the waters of his true self for years. During lunch, instead of eating alone in his office as usual, Thomas found himself inexplicably drawn to the company cafeteria. He sat at an empty table, observing the social ecosystem around him with new awareness. Colleagues laughed, argued, shared stories, the full spectrum of human connection playing out before him. A peculiar sensation stirred in his chest, something between longing and terror. Jung identified this experience as the numinous, when the unconscious suddenly breaks through, creating a moment of awe that can be both attractive and frightening. Thomas was experiencing the gravitational pull of what he had denied himself for so long. That afternoon, Elena knocked on his office door with some marketing proposals. Their meeting was brief, but left Thomas strangely agitated. He noticed details he would normally filter out: the way she gestured when making a point, how her eyes reflected genuine enthusiasm for her ideas, the subtle fragrance of her perfume. According to Jung's concept of projection, what we most strongly react to in others often reflects disowned parts of ourselves. Thomas wasn't merely noticing Elena, he was recognizing aspects of authentic engagement with life that he had systematically eliminated from his own experience. As darkness fell, Thomas found himself driving not toward his empty penthouse, but to his childhood neighborhood across town. He parked outside the modest house where he had grown up, now occupied by strangers. Memories flooded back, his mother's laughter, his father's firm but gentle hand on his shoulder, the sense of belonging that had once felt suffocating but now seemed like a paradise lost. Jung emphasized that healing often begins with a return to origins, a reconnection with what he called the psychological DNA that shaped us. As Thomas sat there, a single tear traced its way down his cheek. The first he had allowed himself. In 15 years, vou desenvolver clímax e conclusão mais extensos, com aproximadamente 1.200 palavras cada parte, mantendo o texto em inglês. The weekend arrived with an unfamiliar emptiness for Thomas. His meticulously planned schedule, usually filled with solitary activities disguised as productivity, now stretched before him like an endless desert. The morning sun cast long shadows across his minimalist apartment, highlighting its pristine emptiness. No photographs adorned the walls, no mementos cluttered the surfaces, nothing to suggest that a human being with memories and connections inhabited this space. Thomas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city awaken beneath him, feeling for the first time the full weight of his isolation. It wasn't merely loneliness he felt. It was an existential vacuum, the complete absence of meaning that comes when one has successfully cut all authentic ties to others. Jung had written extensively about this phenomenon, describing it as the spiritual crisis of modern man. In his seminal work, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung posited that this disconnection from others inevitably leads to a disconnection from oneself, creating a void that no amount of material success or individual achievement can fill. Thomas had reached the pinnacle of what the individualistic value system of modern society considered success, wealth, status, independence. Yet here he stood, hollow and incomplete. The Swiss psychiatrist would have seen Thomas as the perfect embodiment of what happens when the ego becomes so fortified that it blocks access to the deeper self, that mysterious center of the psyche that contains our fullest potential. The dream returned that night with new elements. The labyrinth of mirrors remained, but now water began seeping through the floor, rising slowly but steadily around Thomas's ankles. In Jungian dream analysis, water typically symbolizes the unconscious, with rising water representing emotional content threatening to overwhelm the conscious mind. The shadowy figure at the center of the labyrinth was clearer now, bearing a strange resemblance to Thomas's father, not as the successful businessman he had become, but as the warm, engaged man Thomas vaguely remembered from early childhood. Before ambition and emotional distance had transformed him. "You've been running for so long," the figure said, "but you can't outrun yourself." Thomas woke gasping for air, feeling as though he had been underwater. Sunday morning brought an unexpected development. Thomas's phone rang, his actual phone, not the work line that occasionally buzzed with business matters. The name on the screen nearly caused him to drop the device. Michael Anderson, his former best friend from college, someone he hadn't spoken to in almost 8 years. The severing of that relationship had been one of the first major steps in Thomas's journey toward becoming unattainable. Michael had been too perceptive, too willing to call Thomas out on his emotional withdrawal, too insistent on maintaining genuine connection. Thomas had engineered a falling out over something trivial, then systematically ignored all attempts at reconciliation until they finally stopped. Now, inexplicably, Michael was calling. The conversation was awkward at first. Laden with the weight of unspoken history, Michael explained that he was in town for a conference and had thought of Thomas. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," Michael said, his voice carrying none of the resentment Thomas would have expected. "I had this dream where you were drowning and no one could reach you. Sounds crazy, I know, but I couldn't shake it." Thomas felt a chill run through him. Jung had documented numerous cases of what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seemed to transcend conventional notions of causality, suggesting a deeper connecting principle in the universe. Michael's dream parallelizing. His own seemed too precise to be mere chance. What followed was the most authentic conversation Thomas had experienced in years. Michael spoke of his life, marriage, children, career ups and downs, not as achievements to be showcased, but as experiences that had shaped him. Thomas found himself listening with an intensity that surprised him, as if he were a man dying of thirst, suddenly offered water. When Michael asked about his life, Thomas opened his mouth to deliver his usual, polished narrative of professional accomplishments, but what emerged instead was unexpected honesty. "I've built exactly the life I thought I wanted, and I've never been more miserable." The words hung in the air between them, naked and true. A renowned study from Harvard's Grant and Glueck study, which followed participants for more than 75 years, had conclusively shown that the quality of human relationships was the single greatest predictor of happiness and health, more than wealth, fame, or achievement. Thomas had systematically eliminated the very thing most essential to human flourishing. The conversation ended with an invitation. Michael was having a small gathering that evening at his hotel suite, just a few old friends from college who happened to be in the city. Thomas's immediate instinct was to decline, to retreat back to the safety of his isolation. But something had shifted within him, some internal compass suddenly pointing in a new direction. Jung described this moment as the enantiodromia, the principle that anything pushed to its extreme will eventually transform into its opposite. Thomas had pursued unattainability to its ultimate conclusion and now found himself desperate for connection. "I'll be there," he said, surprising himself as much as Michael. The hours before the gathering were excruciating for Thomas. He changed clothes 3 times, an uncharacteristic indecision plaguing him. His usual armor of designer suits suddenly seemed inappropriate, a costume rather than clothing. He finally settled on something casual, feeling strangely vulnerable. Without his professional facade, as he drove to the hotel, his heart raced with an anxiety he hadn't permitted himself to feel in years. The elevator ride to Michael's floor seemed interminable, each floor number triggering an urge to turn back. Jung would have recognized this as the threshold anxiety that accompanies any significant psychological transition, the fear that arises when we stand at the boundary between our old self and potential transformation. Thomas paused outside the hotel room door, hearing laughter and conversation from within. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it to knock. A physical, manifestation of the earthquake happening in his psyche. A groundbreaking study, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, had demonstrated that the neural pathways activated during social rejection are identical to those activated during physical pain. For someone who had constructed his entire identity around avoiding vulnerability, the prospect of reconnection represented a genuine threat to his nervous system. Yet something stronger than fear propelled him forward, what Jung would identify as the self's inherent drive toward wholeness, the psyche's natural tendency to seek integration of all its parts. The door opened, and Michael's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Thomas, you actually came." The small gathering turned to look at him, faces from the past, people who had known him before his transformation into the unattainable man. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple human connection in their eyes. And then something extraordinary happened, something that Carl Jung would have described as a moment of authentic individuation, when the false self falls away and the true self emerges. Thomas began to cry, not elegant, controlled tears, but raw, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Years of carefully suppressed emotion burst through the dam of his composure, shattering the image he had so painstakingly constructed. What followed that evening marked the beginning of Thomas's journey back to humanity. A slow, often painful, process of reconnection that Jung would have recognized as the true path of individuation. Not the false individuation of separation and unattainability that Thomas had pursued, but the authentic integration of all aspects of self, including the fundamental need for human connection. As Thomas sat surrounded by old friends, sharing stories and gradually allowing himself to be seen, he experienced what researchers at the University of California, Berkeley had identified as elevation, a distinct emotion triggered by witnessing acts of human goodness that transcends self-interest. In Thomas's case, the simple acceptance of these people, their willingness to welcome him back without judgment, created a profound shift in his perception of human relationships. The weeks that followed were characterized by a strange dual existence. During the day, Thomas maintained his professional persona, though colleagues noticed subtle changes. Moments of genuine laughter, a newfound willingness to consider perspectives different from his own, occasional inquiries about their lives that seemed authentically interested rather than merely polite. But in the evening hours, Thomas embarked on what Jung would have called the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious to recover lost parts of himself. He began therapy with a Jungian analyst, a process that felt simultaneously like meeting a stranger and returning home. The analyst introduced him to active imagination, dream analysis, and the concept of the shadow, those disowned aspects of himself that had grown monstrous in their banishment. Elena from marketing became an unexpected ally in Thomas's transformation. Their professional interactions gradually evolved into conversations that extended beyond work, tentative explorations of connection that Thomas navigated with both eagerness and terror. "You're different lately," she observed one evening as they worked late on a project. "Less unreachable." The observation struck Thomas with its accuracy. Jung had noted that genuine transformation is often first recognized not by the individual undergoing change, but by those around them who can perceive the shift in energy. The psychological walls Thomas had built were indeed beginning to come down, brick by painful brick, revealing the vulnerable human being who had been imprisoned within them for so long. The dreams continued, evolving with Thomas's psychological progress. The labyrinth of mirrors gradually transformed into an open landscape, the shadowy guide becoming clearer and more communicative. Jung had documented this progression in many of his patients. As conscious awareness expanded, dream symbolism, often moved from enclosed, confusing spaces to more open environments, reflecting the psyche's increasing freedom and integration. One particular dream stood out. Thomas found himself in a garden where the plants responded to his emotions, blooming when he felt joy, withering when he retreated into his old patterns of detachment. The guide, now clearly bearing both his father's features and his own, explained, "What you nurture grows, what you neglect dies. This is true of plants, relationships, and souls." 6 months into his journey, Thomas made a decision that would have been unthinkable before. He took a leave of absence from his position. Not a strategic career move, but a genuine pause to reassess the life he had built and the person he wanted to become. Jung emphasized that true individuation often requires such breaks from established patterns, creating space for the authentic self to emerge from beneath the socialized persona. Thomas rented a cabin by a lake, far from the urban environment that had facilitated his emotional isolation. There, surrounded by nature and free from the constraints of his carefully constructed daily routine, he began to experience what Jung called synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences that seemed to guide him toward greater wholeness. 1. Such event occurred on a morning walk along the lakeshore. Thomas encountered an elderly fisherman who struck up a conversation with the ease of someone who had never learned to fear connection. The man spoke of his life, 63 years married to the same woman, now gone for 3 years, but still with me in everything I do. He described their relationship not as a fairy tale, but as a practice of continuous return. "People think love is always feeling close," the old man said, watching his fishing line with peaceful attention. "But real love is what brings you back when you've drifted apart." Something in these words resonated deeply with Thomas, not just about relationships with others, but about his relationship with himself. Jung would have called this an encounter with the wise old man archetype made manifest, the universe offering guidance through seemingly random human connection. Thomas's return to the city after his retreat was not a return to his old life. He moved out of the sterile penthouse, finding instead a smaller place in a neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors. He accepted a different position at his company, one that utilized his skills but required more collaboration and human engagement. Most significantly, he began the slow, often awkward process of reaching out to people he had systematically pushed away over the years. Some relationships could not be recovered. The damage had been too great, the absence too prolonged. Jung acknowledged this as part of the genuine individuation process. Not all connections are meant to be restored, and accepting loss is as much a part of wholeness as cultivating new growth. On the anniversary of his breakdown at Michael's gathering, what Thomas now recognized as his breakthrough moment, he hosted a dinner party in his new home. The guests were an eclectic mix: old friends, new colleagues, his therapist, and Elena, who had gradually become something more than a colleague. As Thomas looked around the table at these people whose lives now intersected with his in meaningful ways, he was struck by a profound realization. Becoming unattainable had not made him stronger or more independent. It had nearly destroyed him. True strength, he now understood, lay in the courage to remain open despite the inevitable pain that comes with human connection. In his journal that night, Thomas wrote words that echoed Jung's fundamental insight about the human condition. "We are not meant to be islands, complete unto ourselves. We are fragments seeking wholeness through connection to others, to the world, and to the deeper parts of ourselves we have exiled. When I made myself unattainable, I didn't just shut others out, I locked myself in. And the key was never in my possession alone." Jung would have recognized in these words the essence of his life's work, the understanding that individuation, true selfhood, is never achieved through isolation, but through meaningful relationship with both the inner and outer worlds. perhaps? The greatest irony of becoming unattainable is this: in our desperate attempt to protect ourselves from the pain of human connection, we inflict upon ourselves the most devastating wound of all, the separation from our own souls. What walls have you built that have become your prison?